So we've seen how to make some simple React views and render them, and also how to add state to our application. But I want to show you how to create a finer separation of concerns between your data, your controller, and your views. And we want each one of these things to have a separate component that manages its own concern. So for our controller, we've already got our app. This is what we call the top level component, and it will act as an interface between the data and the views. First, let's do the data side. To manage data, we want to create a class called store, and this will have state very similar to the state that our app had in the previous video. We have to-dos, and we have new to-do. Okay, great. And this store will also be responsible for fetching the data. So you can make a method called fetch to-dos, which uses the fetch data function to sort of simulate an AJAX request. And it will set the to-dos on state. And we also want a simple accessor method for our to-dos, get to-dos, and that will return this.state.todos. Cool. How do we inject this store into our application? Well, we can pass it in via props. And that looks like this. Now props kind of look like HTML attributes in JSX, but it's really better to think of them almost like function arguments, where the function is the component. So we're passing in an instance of our store into the app, and it's going to have the name store on app.props. Okay, so now if you recall, we want to make sure we fetch data on component did mount, and we call this.props.store.fetch to-dos. Oops, there we go. Now we're going to run into something a little bit tricky here, which is that when we call this fetch to-dos function, our app is not going to re-render with the new data. That's because this function only mutates the store, and the app doesn't really know anything about the store. It just has a reference to it here in props. So we want to add a new method. We want to use the component willMount lifecycle method on the React component, and this will allow us to do some setup that we want to happen before the component mounts. And in this function, what we're going to do is we're going to this.props.store.update, and that's going to equal a fat arrow function that we'll call this.forceUpdate. ForceUpdate will cause the app component to re-render and also to re-render its children. So this essentially links together the app and the store, and it gives the store a way to tell the app that it needs to update. Now we can add in our fetch to-dos method this.update. So when the store is finished fetching the to-dos and updating its data, it will call this.update, which will force update our app component. We could do what we did last time, which is just render the to-dos inline. Let's start with that. So to-dos equals this.props.store.getToDos, and then we to-dos.map to-do, and we'll use the p tag again. To-do.text. I believe that's what they look like. Yep. And let's see if that works first of all. Great. But remember, we want to have a data portion, which we have in our store. And we also want to have a controller, which is our app. And we want to have views as well. So even though this is a really simple example application, we can still start to break out these three different parts. Let's say const to-do equals props return div. So what is this? This is the start of a stateless component. It's basically just a function. As you can see, it's a function that takes props and returns JSX. So we want this to be a to-do component. So where does to-do come from here? Well, what we can do here is, instead of returning a p tag, we can return our to-do component and pass in the to-do as props. And I even want to go one step further and take that map line out and put it up into a method, render to-dos. We can put that right above the render method so that we can find it easily. And we'll return to-dos.map, and for each to-do, we return a to-do component. Now, this kind of factoring out may seem excessive when we're dealing with an app this simple, but it really pays dividends as your app grows in complexity. As you can see, our render function is very simple. Actually, we don't even need that, right? And we can see very clearly you barely have to read it. We're rendering a template wherein we render our to-dos under our heading. And even if this grew a lot in size, if we stuck to this pattern, it would still be very easy to read. So let's just make sure that this actually works. First of all, we want to make sure that our props are going to be functioning the way we want them in our to-do component. Our to-do component is going to get props.todo. So here we can just do this. Let's try this out. Okay, there's a little bit of a bug somewhere. Ah, right. Equals this dot props dot store dot get to dos. Perfect. Okay, and there it is. Great. Next, why don't we try adding a new to-do functionality. So first of all, we want to separate our controller from our views. So let's make a new, or let's call it something else, like to-do form component. And that's also going to be a stateless component. And it's going to return probably just a input and a button. Okay, and a button. This button should say something like save. Perfect. Okay, now for this form, we're going to need two things. We're going to need a onChange handler for the input. Let's say props.onChange. And then we're going to need a click handler for the button. On click, we'll call that save to do. Whoops, that should be props.save to do. Actually, let's make this more specific. We can call that new to do change. Now, these are coming in through pops, so we need to pass them down into the to do form here. So let's say save to do, this dot save to do, and new to do change. New to do change. I'm going to do a little bit of formatting here to make this look a little bit better. What will these methods look like? Let's start with new to do change. This is an onChange handler and an input component, which means that it's going to get the event object, and the text of the input is going to be, let's call it text. It's going to be an e.target.value. And what do we want to do with that value? Well, we want it to update the new to-do value in the state of our store. That means that in our store, we also need a update new to-do function. Which is going to take the text and set this .state.new to-do equal to the text. And then it's also going to update, because we want to re-render the application. So what happens here? We've got the text, and we're going to do this .props.store.new new to-do change. We pass in the text. Perfect. Now we also want to pass the value back down into our input so that the value of the input reflects the value that's in our store. So we need a new prop here called value. This.props.store.new to-do value. Actually, you know what? I'm just gonna pass it directly down, and I'm gonna also say const store equals this.props.store. I can make that a little bit shorter. Okay, now the value is being passed down into the to-do form as value. So our input is a value of props.value. Great, so now we're getting the feeding the value up via new to-do change and then back down into value. And now we need the save to do click handler. Save to do. And this should of course just invoke a method on the store. We'll call it save new to do. And we go up to our store here. And save new to do will take the new to do text and insert it as a new to do in our to dos array. So we say this.state.todos.push this.state.new to do. And then again we want to update. This is getting a little messy because it's all in one file. Generally we would not do this in a normal application. If we had a normal React app, each one of these stateless components would be in its own file, together with a CSS file defining its styles. Store would of course be in its own file, and so would our app class. File structure is very important, so we'd want to keep everything nice and organized. And we're sort of pushing at the limits of what we can do cleanly in one file, as you can see. Okay, so let's see if we've got everything that we need. We've got new to do change, save to do, and value, which comes down from store. Let's see if it works. Okay, so new to do goes here. I want to record new video. There we go. And it didn't work. Not too surprising. Wow, that's beautiful. Cannot read props of undefined. Okay. Ah, right. This is an important point actually. When we pass down methods like this, they're going to lose the context. This, right? They're not going to be in the correct context anymore. Now if you're using ES6, you can do this, which will auto bind the methods. But we don't have that because we're just using the Babel browser file. So what we have to do is bind them manually, like this. Now let's see if that works. Oops. Oops. Yeah, something went wrong. New to do changes here. Whoops. I got the name wrong. There's the correct name. And now we should be good. Record new video. There we go. Excellent. And promote my videos. Great. And now you can see we've got the whole thing wired together with our data, our controller, and our stateless components all separated out.